We've done this before.
Yes, and we have done this before, and we're so happy to have MC with us today. And I think without really much further, I think perhaps you can introduce yourself about where you are, what your research topic is, and then we dive right into the first question.
Oh, okay. I'm MC. We're going to be talking about embodied interaction today. My accent is Canadian. I work in the UK, but I like to connect with folks all over the place and of course, coming to any party that Albrecht is hosting is always going to be a very good time. So I'm just delighted to be here and hope we all have a fantastic session this afternoon.
Yeah, and I think you talked about embodied interaction, and I have been at workshops. I have looked at your tutorial, and I'm still not sure what it is. So, is it just sort of a buzzword nobody else used before, or is there sort of something deeper to it?
Well, heck, that's a heck of a challenge to start with to prove depth of a concept, Albrecht. And we don't even have wine to pass around to go into that level right away. I think one of the ways that you had framed it previously was to say, how is this not embodied interaction? So let's just look at it by a contrast for a second. And one of the contrasts you might propose is that in '99, Paul Dorisch made everybody in HCI aware of embodied interaction coming from the philosophical perspectives of Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, effectively that everything we do is mediated through the body. And in embodied interaction, especially that brought a lot of social context issues into HCI that had not been as prevalent prior to. And I think one of the ways that we could frame embodied and embodied, and yes, I coined the term embodied deliberately to differentiate it from embodied, despite what our spell checkers still do, is that embodied interaction in that frame, we could consider it that the body is recognized as the location of interaction, but it kind of treats the body as a black box in which it's focused on the input and the output of the body, what goes into the body and has an effect that produces an output. It's less concerned with that messy complexity underneath the hood of the body. And embodied interaction says that by lifting that lid, by daring to engage with the messy complexity of how those 11 organ systems interact with each other to create mental states, to create physical states, to manage how we are doing when we're not thinking about states, that is really valuable if we want to create designs that enable us to function, that serve our needs for quality of life and well-being, rather than us trying to fit into a design. And with that, starting from that embodied perspective, I've been having a mental crisis of going, I think everything we've designed for work in particular is wrong if you look at it from that perspective.
I think that was one of the things why we really wanted to talk to you. I think there's sort of this, what did we get wrong? But before that, I basically, when I studied, that's nearly, it's half a life ago, I guess. It's, I did medicine as a minor. And I think I don't remember too much, but I remember the complexity is so high that even a lot of people who studied as their main subject don't really get it. Mm-hmm. And that sort of the advances in medical science over the last 20 years are massive. So there are things, and I think you have talked about the gut, about other stuff, we haven't really thought of 20 years back. And now what is me sort of as an HCI researcher, or us sort of as researchers coming with a CS background, with a psychology background, what can we contribute what the others haven't not really sort of done? So is it not a bit overclaiming for an HCI person to say, oh, I understand the body better than you and I designed for it, so let's go there?
If we said that might bring up an argument, but I'm always prepared to settle that by arm wrestling. So if we set that aside though for a moment in terms of where we can engage with this, what we've tried to do by looking at this complexity is actually to try to do what we do in computation, which is create models that can be useful refinements of complex processes that still let us interact with them. I mean, I would go back though and say, Albrecht, that HCI does express a particular level of arrogance when it comes to designing for the body without knowing anything about it. We're really good at saying, here's this new device that'll help you become healthy, where we have very little background other than maybe a couple of articles in the press saying it's good to stand up. So now we're going to make stuff that triggers you to stand up. So this is not new. So I'm actually trying to say we need to spend some time. If we're going to look at health and well-being, don't we have a responsibility to understand some of the principles that inform that? But being an engineer, primarily wanting to be able to say exactly that. How do you create a pathway into that complexity? And so we have a formula. It's N5 plus C4 in parentheses plus T over C. And what that really is that there are only, if we look at the model of the body, I'm going to take one quick second to say, here's parts of the model. There's only 3 things based on that complexity that you need to know about in terms of functional properties. And then you can dig deeper into it. One is that the body's only concern is to maintain its internal environment. That's homeostasis. As long as the body can do that, you're not dead. Second, the thing that serves homeostasis is metabolism, which is about how the body, every cell in the body requires energy, and how is it going to produce that? Where is its resource for that? What does it do with that energy in terms of being able to synthesize things to keep it alive? And then 3, how does it recycle what it no longer is able to use in one process to put into another? And so we've got homeostasis, we've got metabolism, and the third thing that we interact with as interaction designers is that we are constantly adapting in order to maintain homeostasis. So think of a really easy example is that you're working out at the gym and it's causing you to get sore one day because your muscles have to adapt to this new load. In order to adapt to that new load, your body will take resources from its nutrients to produce new tissue, muscle fibers to enable that load to be better distributed, and also put in some extra mitochondria so that you can oxygenate without getting out of breath quite as quickly. So those adaptations are not just that kind of longer term tissue development, but they're happening every second. Every second we're standing here talking to each other, we are responding in such a way that is causing adaptations, perturbations in what gets decided to be metabolized in order to maintain homeostasis. So with that model, what can we do? Embodied interaction proposed at the first part of it, what's happening inside the body, is that there's only 5 ways that we can actually interact with the body and its complexity. And these are what I've called the sort of semi-volitional processes. These are things that we can choose to do. And by calling it volitional, it's like, well, our heart beats without us really paying attention to it. That's autonomous, non-volitional. Whereas us talking right now, pretty volitional. But there are these other processes, move, eat, engage, cogitate, new thoughts, and sleep, that we do every day. All of us do them. We have to do them at some point in order to survive, but we get to choose how we instantiate those. And so if embodied interaction, and we can talk about insourcing and outsourcing later, but the thing is if we focus on these principles of where we can actually have an effect, which are only on those 5 things if we care about our well-being and performance, then our choice as designers, to get back to your original question of what can we do as designers using a paradigm like that, is to say, what do we want to do with those? Are our design choices to help people learn how to use these individually? Are our choices to look at infrastructure in order to design better interactions with larger scale processes so that people have more global effective access to the kinds of foods that will enable performance versus fast foods that just enable cheap calories? So that's part of the design space. And again, we can talk about, you mentioned the gut. I mean, I talked about in 5 of the things that we can do. There's also 4 fundamental bits that affect every cell in our body that we can also interact with. and time and context are the other parts of that equation. But that's,
I think I'll stop you here a little bit to dig in some of the parts deeper. I think one of the things what I have realized after you had visited us in Munich, that I think we were really good as interaction designers, as HCI people, in moving it into the wrong direction. I think we have created things like TikTok. We know how to make people not sleep. We have figured out how to make people not stand up by sending emails and putting stuff in the cloud drive. So I think we have figured out how not to do it. So that's an interesting one. But I hand over to Katrin for another question.
Yeah. So looking at your work, we found really interesting that you propose discomfort design, which you mentioned, like sports. Most people of us start doing sports because we know it's healthy, but then it hurts. So we kind of have to come over this. And so you say that briefly hurts, but in midterm helps us. So how do you define discomfort design in HCI, and how can we design for it? How could such technology look like, or integrated in our life?
So discomfort design is thinking about, that for us to adapt, that constant adaptation is not always comfortable. And the thing about HCI is in discomfort design is not to create uncomfortable experiences. We don't need any batteries to help us be uncomfortable. We're really good at making ourselves uncomfortable all the time. I think the challenge is how to do what HCI does really well, which is its focus, is how to make something accessible. How, with a computational device, can you enter into a process? So a significant design challenge for HCI to help with human adaptation is actually, how do we design to help embrace the discomfort? And there are some parameters that you can look at there, such as, okay, what's the value proposition for being with that discomfort? So how do you help somebody who's going to the gym for the first time, who might be lifting weights, and as you say, the next day they're so sore they can't move, that they never go back again, because they never want to feel like that again. And I don't blame them, because there was nothing there that helped them say, you don't want to do this hard right now. You just want to get the feel of things right now. So there's an opportunity there in terms of asking in an interaction, what do you want to do? Anticipating where the pain points are going to be, and helping that person actually embrace that process because they know what's coming, and potentially reflect back to that person how this is aligning with the effect they want to achieve. So for instance, also losing weight can be really painful if you know you have to change your eating practices just to eat less. There is a period of adaptation that is just habituated ghrelin responses. What can we design not to cause that discomfort, but to help embrace it and see that the adaptation they seek is associated with that embracing?
I have two examples, and maybe you can help me to understand which fits better. So let's say sports. I could use EMS, which makes it harder for me to do sports, or I probably could have like a playful sport, like I maybe want to run after a ball, like a kid. So would both be discomfort design, or rather the second, or rather the first?
Again, I think discomfort design focuses on how do you help somebody stay for as long as they need to stay for that session with something that could be uncomfortable, that that they can adapt to that discomfort. So I might not be hearing what you're asking, because I don't think it matters what the practice is. It's just like, if play is always comfortable, unless it's socially uncomfortable and you're afraid to do it, then that's something to look at too. Okay. But it's like, what if you're trying to learn how to do an ANOVA and you can't stand stats and it makes you really uncomfortable, but you need to find a pathway into that so that you can stay with those things until you get that aha moment in your head. Okay. That's where we don't design stuff.
Okay, I get it. Okay, so a second term which you used like for research in embodied interaction is tuning, like tuning our body. And as our conversations are about, like, you know, make people healthier, live healthier, feel healthier, what technology do you think fits best to tune our body? What about augmenting our body or even implanting technology?
Well, these are two very, very cool and different questions. So just on the first side, tuning specifically is about how we can help people learn about, build knowledge, skills, and practice, KSP, knowledge, skills, and practice about how each of those in-5, for instance, affect us so that we can debug ourselves. And so on our side of the fence, we've been looking at tools that help people explore these factors, different strategies in these factors, and that seek to help them say, how are you feeling when you do it this way versus that way in this context for this length of time? So that's the tuning approach is, and it's, we talk about tuning, especially instead of behavior change, because I said, everybody's eating, we're all moving, we all go to sleep. We don't need to change that. We need to dial in what's going to work for us in the context we're using it. Now that's that. That okay? Okay, so the augmented thing is kind of like another continua that I'd propose in the design space is to say, here's raw, here's cyborg. You can be anywhere in here with the technology that you use. Will the technology help you to become like an endurance runner where you have no technology except maybe your sneakers and you're going for a run, versus do you want to be effectively in some kind of augmentation suit that enables you to have superpowers? And without any value judgment on that, the only question I would ask is, what are you trying to achieve? And what's it going to help doing? So by having an explicit continua that says we can use this continua as a design material, raw here, cyborg here, to say, is it useful even for a period of time to have augmentation here? And then at this period of time, no, we don't need it anymore. Or is this something we want all the time? A student of mine, Seb Metaleu, is looking at how can we use AR, for instance, to augment an environment we're moving in to help learn a second language. And I know, Albert, this is an area that's been of interest for you guys, is that, so that's a temporal augmentation to improve somebody's capacity for learning faster based on motor learning theory that can then be let go of once that kind of skill set has been acquired.
Yeah, it looks to me that we really have to learn who our user is. It
Yeah.
to be how
Yeah.
really like on the individual level. So I never used the quantified self app, and I do not run, even though I think it would be good for me, you know. So where are the quantified self apps gone, and how could they be better, you know, how could they follow your approach on embodied interaction?
I think that it comes back to, what are we doing this for? How is it, because all these apps are doing is sensor-based capturing of data for the most part. They're not engaging in a conversation with somebody usually about how they're feeling or how they're connecting the data to make sense of their world all the time. This is what usually we're looking for, is data to tell us how we're doing. And again, that's sort of at what we call the outsourcing end, where you're asking a device for a particular time to tell you something about yourself. The embodied interaction focus might suggest, again, insourcing to outsourcing, how would you bring that data-based experience into your sensory experience so you can connect, for instance, here's 10,000 steps here that your Fitbit tells you that you've done. What do we need to do to help you feel what 10,000 steps is like? And feel how you're doing relative to that today, if that's sufficient or if you need to go more, without needing the device. How do we build that sensory awareness and skill set?
So let me jump in here with a question that leads a bit further from here. And I think it also comes from a discussion we had when you visited, which I think is sort of, it gave me a lot to think. It's the idea, if we sit over 10, 20 years, which we do in the office, then the problem is we tell our body a certain sort of it's basically a certain shape we take, which may be telling our body the wrong thing. And now I think the question about walking, and I think again, sort of there was Duncan put it in. I think walking will not work for everybody. There will be people in wheelchairs, etc. So I think this is sort of the inclusive question. People who are ill with sort of parts of their movement apparatus. So I think for me, one of the questions is more on a higher level. In HCI, we usually do, even if you look at behavioral change, the longest studies that people usually do are a year. And I think most of the studies are 3 weeks before the deadline. And then we learn all about behavioral change. And I think there I envy colleagues in other subjects. I know people in medicine, they have started in their 40s with an experiment, and they say, I will publish that paper the year before I retire. They basically collect data on something. Things like this are like this long-term thing. It seems we don't really look in the long term, neither in research nor in development. How can we get people into the long-term perspective? And I think I take TikTok again, it's designed to engage me, to have fun very quickly, but it doesn't really look at the long-term effect. I'm sleeping too little, I'm reading too little, whatever I do too little due to that. How can, and if you look into papers, it's all about sort of these engagement things over the last years. How can we take this longer term perspective and how can we change our research to really not forget the longer term perspective, and also in companies, how we can take the longer term perspective? Will this pay off?
I mean, speaking for myself and the work in our little lab, Albrecht, is that we don't necessarily need to do 20-year studies to replicate what we already know about the physiology of the body. Is that if we're sedentary for that many hours a day, I can tell you the host of things based on that complexity of what will not be functioning appropriately in our bodies. It's that simple. We have that knowledge. So it's like, again, this is why having it is actually important, maybe more so than the long-term studies, is to actually get familiar with the studies that people have done for that length of time, that have developed the basis of that physiology, to say, okay, for instance, here's one of my favorites right now, is that we don't need to do any more studies to find out how the ciliary muscles around the lens of the eye work. We know there's been now decades of research that show that if you're doing close screen work, again, for as long as you're sitting down on a screen, you're going to induce myopia. And I've talked to too many people and interviewed too many people that have said, you know what, in the past year, I've had to go up 2 levels in my glasses. If you tried to sell somebody a screen technology today and said, you can have this fantastic high resolution screen, but it's going to cost you your eyesight in X number of years, and you're going to notice it this way, that you're always going to have to wear plastic on your eyes for the rest of your life to be able to have this screen, how many of us would have said, that's a crap design? I'm not going to induce harm on myself. And yet we do this all the time because we're not asking those questions about, what do we know about our physiology that this might screw up? And you're absolutely right. Science has changed. I mean, there's a point, the reason why I think we've done everything wrong is that we've had a philosophy about the body going back to Descartes, and certainly made popular by people like Edison, that have said, oh, the only reason for having a body is to carry the brain around. Wrong. The brain is part of the body, and everything that happens to the body affects the rest of the body, which includes the brain. And so that model of saying we don't really have to think about the body, we can just make it as comfortable as possible and go wheel ourselves around from one chair to another, is absolutely false. And so this is why our lab is pushing on make normal better. It's not necessarily about improving health, if you want to talk big picture here. It's really about saying, what are the cultural and statistical norms that make it hard for us to be healthy? And if you have a culture that's normalized seated work, long hours, lack of sleep, and the one thing about COVID is doing is that it's shaking up a lot of these norms right now, we can start to ask questions about these fundamental designs, because people are going, you know what, I'm sleeping now. I'm not spending 3 hours in a commute. And somehow, even though I'm utterly stressed out, I feel a little better. I wonder what's going on with my work. So that again is kind of a long way around, but I think it's worth doing to say, we do not have to be the ones to have to do those kind of long studies. We can leverage what we already know about our physiology and increasingly about our neurology, and then say, how do we design to support that? And test those designs.
Okay, so I think this is sort of a lot of points to take in. So, but I think I want to dig deeper on sort of, and I think some of us probably, we have, many of us in the call have probably gotten rejected Chi papers since yesterday. We have a lot in the lab, but I think sort of the question here is, we know our field is very competitive, and I think if we run studies that are, and I think it's really sort of the perspective of the PhD student, not sort of the old professors. It's sort of, so basically, how do we get people to really take this longer term perspective? And I think a PhD takes 4 or 5 years. Basically, how can we really take this longer perspective? What would be good studies? And I completely see that we have a lot of knowledge what we could do better. And I think we talk at the moment a lot about walking meetings. I think this is one of the themes we talk a lot about. Basically, and it's not just about walking, it's being outside while doing meetings, not being inside, and all those things. But doing a reasonable experiment is incredibly hard. And so how do we go there?
The community here has lots of answers. And just to touch on the Chi rejection thing, I have had so much experience, and you have too, Albrecht, in rejection. I bet I have more than you. That you just start like, and your response to this, his response to this, folks, has been fantastic. It's like, if I keep getting rejected, I'm going to start my own damn conference and create a new space. Because, we don't have to be slaves to Chi. You can come to our workshop, actually, about embodied interaction, and start growing the field and become heroes of this field yourself. I invite you today to do that. As for the studies, yeah, of course they're hard, but again, it depends on what our framework is. Like, again, the student that I'm talking about, I am really excited by the work that he's proposing to do, to say, look, there's the cerebellum here. That has a lot of patterns about movement, but we also start to know that it has something to do with language. So what if we could put movement and language learning together using that model of language acquisition with some AR stuff, moving an environment to test, do we actually learn better when we have this support? And you could only do this with AR and AI to support this for an individual in an environment without somebody who can talk to them at the same time in another language. That's really cool to say, how do we do this? Does it work? In what conditions does it work? Do we have to improve our AR glasses so they work better outside? $3,500 HoloLens that can't function outside in the sunlight. So these are opportunities for physical design, for electronics, for computer science. They're just kind of saying, let's ask different questions. Let's just ask different questions and create our spaces to support each other, exploring those kinds of questions. I am so burnt on Chi and the whole Chi fascist evaluation model. I'm sorry for anybody that didn't get their papers in. Let's start something else.
But I think sort of I think, yeah, we have to accept sort of that the community is moving one way, but sometimes if you're at the forefront, it may be the wrong forefront. I think there's always a risk if you don't go with the established stuff. But I think I probably have in the community most rejected Chi papers. So, and I'm still alive, and I'm still sort of writing every year with the students. I have one more question, and then I think we have seen already a number of questions in the chat I would like to pick on. I have one other one. I think you're putting a lot of emphasis on the body and going away from the body that carries the brain. But I think looking at a lot of visions we see in virtual reality is really moving the other way. We don't need a body. I think there have been sort of fictional movies I quite like. I think you've probably seen some. But I think for me, the question is it really, if social media, it's a lot about presentation of body, but not the existence of body. And I think if we move then to social VR, the body doesn't matter anymore. So and I think looking into fiction, there are quite a number of ideas how this could look like. is the VR thing. You have been talking about AR, but on your on one of your web pages, the title picture is a person with VR on a swing. So the question is VR going completely the wrong direction?
With VR in
Sorry?
that picture, Albrecht,
Pardon?
that you're referring to. What is the person doing in that picture on the site with the VR on?
I think they're riding they're on a swing.
They're doing something physical, and they're using a very short period of time. The glasses, this is work that was coming out of Nottingham, and I'm sorry I forget the researcher's name who did it, and it's great because that simulates the feeling of being on a roller coaster while you're actually moving. So there are mechanisms for connecting the two. But again, this is another factor in Embodied. It's about what are you trying to do and how long you're trying to do it. If somebody's trying to do a short connection and they're in an immersive environment and it's for a particular period of time, what harm is that going to cause if it's being counterbalanced with all the other things that we like to do? It's when there's no frickin' balance, as with anything, that there can be problems. And so this is the kind of thing that is a design concern, is time. How long are you expecting somebody to use something for what purpose? And the fiction that you refer to, like, again, it comes from that Edisonian, if you will, the body is just to carry the brain around fallacy about how our physiology works. We are not in a position to escape 300,000 years of Homo sapiens evolution yet. And there's no need to, unless we're a bunch of you know, we don't know. I'll just put it down to ignorance, that we don't appreciate the capacity and amazingness of our bodies. This is not to say that other experiences that VR can bring are in any way wrong. It's just asking about time and balance. And if you give yourself as much time to develop your body and your awareness and your sensors in your own body and how you feel, so, and I'm pointing at, you know, Albrecht, I know you ski and run and do all sorts of crazy stuff outside. So devil's advocating there, and that's fine. It's just, can we not do better for ourselves? Can we not, and not just us as elite, affluent knowledge workers, but for the rest of the planet? You know, the body is not going to disappear, and we're actually better human beings, kinder, gentler, better when we work our bodies that do exist, so that they have higher capacity to be gentler, easier. And again, that comes from understanding the complexity inside of us about how our hormonal systems interact with our workloads to manage and mitigate stress responses. We can be wonderful Zen people if we move a bit more.
Okay, so I think I put into the chat one link, which you just sort of reminded me of. Brandon Walker of Nottingham. I was working with him during my PhD, and he basically he's the envy of a lot of people in our field, because he managed the funding agency to pay for a lot of roller coaster rides. So he calls himself a thrill engineer, and he managed to get at some point a proposal through which basically made him study roller coasters and how you create sort of the engagement. So there's a few videos about him out there. He is a really interesting person. He's an aeronautics engineer who turned thrill engineer. So there are a few links. And I think with this, we stop the recording, and I think we